She spat in the human's face, and in that single second, the entire council chamber froze in disbelief because nothing like this had ever happened before in the Grand Hall of the Galactic Union. The chamber was a vast place built of shining crystal. Walls and tall pillars where hundreds of alien races gathered to speak about laws, peace, and control over the stars. The seats rose high in a circle, and the leaders of worlds sat in them, each surrounded by aides and guards. It was meant to be a place of dignity, but today dignity was shattered when the alien ambassador, a tall figure with sharp scales and burning golden eyes, leaned forward and spat directly into the face of the human envoy, who stood calm in the center of the floor. His name was Daniel, and though he was only one man among giants, he stood straighter than anyone else in that hall. The sound of the spit was small, but the silence that followed it was like thunder. Every alien turned to look, and some began to laugh while others looked nervous, because insulting another race in such a way was almost an act of war. Humans were new to the council, a young species who had only joined the interstellar stage in the last decade. They were called reckless by some, dangerous by others, and weak by many who had ruled the stars for thousands of years. The ambassador, who spat at Daniel, was known for hating humans most of all. He had argued again and again that humanity was unfit for power and too wild to be trusted. Now he had shown his hatred openly, thinking the human would shout, would strike back, would lose control in front of everyone. But Daniel did not move. He did not lift a hand, did not raise his voice, did not even wipe the spit from his face. He stood as if carved from stone, his eyes locked on the alien who insulted him. That silence began to spread like a heavy weight through the chamber. Laughter died quickly, and whispers started. Why was the human not reacting? Why was he so calm when everyone expected rage? The alien ambassador smirked, thinking he had humiliated the human beyond repair, but deep inside he felt something strange. Daniel's eyes were steady, cold, and full of something far more dangerous than anger. They carried a quiet promise, a storm that had not yet broken. The alien ambassador shifted in his seat, and for the first time his smirk began to fade. The council leader, an elder with long silver skin that shimmered under the lights, tried to speak and calm the room, but his voice trembled. Even he could feel the strange energy building in the air. Some aides looked away because they could not stand Daniel's unblinking stare. The guards tightened their grips on their weapons, though no one had moved. Daniel slowly raised a hand to his face. Every eye in the hall followed that motion. He wiped the spit away with his fingers, looked at it for a brief moment, then lowered his hand calmly. Still he said nothing. The silence became unbearable. For a hall that always roared with debates, with shouting, with threats and laughter, the weight of his silence was suffocating. It was as if the entire chamber had fallen into a vacuum. The alien ambassador tried to laugh again, louder this time, as if to break the tension. "See?" he declared, his voice echoing around the hall. "Humans are weak. They cannot defend themselves, they cannot fight, they cannot." But his voice cracked as Daniel tilted his head ever so slightly, and that movement cut his words like a blade. No human words were needed. The look in his eyes alone seemed to silence the galaxy. Across the hall, some alien delegates whispered to each other that they had heard humans were unpredictable, that they carried something in their spirit that no technology could measure, and maybe this was proof. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were suddenly afraid of one man who had not even spoken. The ambassador who had spat on him felt his throat dry and for the first time wondered if he had made a mistake far greater than he imagined. The chamber lights flickered softly, not because of power, but because of the tension that pressed into the air. The silence was alive now. It crawled across the walls, it pressed into every heart, it made even the strongest alien warriors uneasy. Daniel's calmness was not weakness, it was power. a quiet power that no one understood yet. Inside, Daniel thought of Earth. He thought of all the wars, the pain, the survival against impossible odds that had shaped his people. He remembered that silence was not emptiness, silence was discipline. A human could endure an insult, a wound, even a war, without breaking. And when the time came to answer, the answer would be final. He did not need to explain that to the council. They would learn it on their own. The alien who spat at him began to sweat, his golden eyes darting around as if the other delegates would support him, but none spoke. All of them now watched Daniel, not him. The focus had shifted completely. The ambassador's victory had become his defeat, and yet Daniel still had not spoken a word. When the session was finally called to a pause, the council members left the chamber in hushed tones. No one laughed anymore. No one mocked. The insult that was meant to break humanity had only given them something far more dangerous, respect mixed with fear. And the one who spat could not sleep that night, because even when he closed his eyes he saw Daniel's face. Silent, calm, unbroken. The first day of silence had begun. And already the galaxy was unsettled. The council chamber was quiet long after the insult, but the silence did not end when the meeting ended. It followed the delegates into the halls, into the shuttle bays, into the shadowed rooms where leaders whispered to each other. The story of what happened spread faster than light across the station. They said the alien ambassador spat in the human's face, and the human did not react, not even with words, not even with anger, not even with the smallest sound. At first some laughed and said the human had been humiliated, but the more they thought about it, the less they laughed. Something in that silence was wrong, something heavy and dangerous, and no one could stop thinking about it. The alien ambassador who spat, his name spoken with fear in private, walked back to his quarters with guards at his side, but even surrounded, he felt alone. The silence of the human clung to him like a shadow. He remembered the eyes of Daniel staring at him, steady, calm, unbroken, and the memory made his chest tighten. He had stood over many enemies before, had shouted them down, insulted them, crushed them with words, but never had he been so unsettled by someone who did nothing. Every step to his quarters seemed louder than normal. Every breath seemed short. And when the door closed behind him, he collapsed into his chair and realized he was shaking. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to the human embassy on the station. His aides followed him, whispering questions, asking if he was angry, asking why he stayed quiet, asking why he let the insult pass. Daniel gave them no answer. He removed his coat, folded it neatly, placed it aside, and sat by the large window that showed the endless stars. He looked out at them for a long time. His aides grew restless. They wanted to speak. They wanted to understand, but none dared to disturb him. In that stillness they felt something, the same thing the council had felt, silence that was not weakness but strength. Rumors grew in the corridors. Some races claimed the human envoy must be planning something. Others said humans had strange rituals, and his silence was the start of one. Still others believed he carried hidden technology, a weapon perhaps, something that needed no sound to strike. Fear began to weave itself into the whispers. The insult that was meant to shame humanity had instead wrapped the galaxy in suspense. Ambassador who spat grew restless in his quarters. He called his aides and demanded they tell him if the human had spoken since the insult. They told him no. Daniel had said nothing, not a single word. The ambassador shouted at them, demanding to know what silence meant, but they had no answer. That night he could not sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel wiping his face and lowering his hand with that same calm expression. And each time he felt smaller, weaker, as if the silence was inside him now, eating at his thoughts. In the following days the council chamber reopened and new debates began, but no one forgot the silence. When Daniel entered the chamber, the room grew colder. Delegates who once laughed at humans now stayed quiet. Even those who despised his kind felt nervous. They expected him to finally speak, to finally react, but he did not. He sat in his seat, listened, watched, and said nothing. The silence stretched from day to day, and each day it grew heavier. Some alien leaders began to avoid him, afraid his eyes would meet theirs. Others began to respect him, whispering that perhaps humanity had a strength no one understood. A few even feared that Daniel's silence was more dangerous than warships or weapons. They thought of Earth's history, of the wars humans had survived, of the way they had risen so fast in the galaxy, and they wondered if silence was another weapon forged from suffering and survival. The ambassador who spat became more and more unsettled. At first he told himself he had won, that the human was too afraid to speak, but with each day, his confidence broke down. He began to see Daniel in his dreams, standing in the center of the chamber, saying nothing, only staring, and each time he woke drenched in sweat. His own aides noticed his trembling hands, his restless pacing, his sudden bursts of anger. He shouted at them for no reason and accused them of betrayal. They began to fear him, not because of his power, but because of his weakness. Daniel's silence was spreading like a disease. It did not only affect the ambassador, it spread through the council itself. Delegates hesitated before speaking. They chose their words carefully, as if the human might silently judge them. In a place once filled with noise, laughter, and argument, quiet moments grew longer, and no one could explain why. They only knew it was connected to the man who refused to break his silence. Back in the human embassy, Daniel continued his stillness. He ate in silence, he worked in silence, and when aides tried to question him, he only looked at them and they fell quiet. Some of them began to feel the same pressure that the aliens felt, the sense that silence was a wall no one could break. A few were unsettled, but many grew proud, because they realized the galaxy was seeing something it had never seen before. Humans did not need to shout to be heard. The ambassador who spat reached his breaking point late one night. He sat alone, staring at the wall, his mind racing. He told himself again and again that humans were weak, that he had humiliated Daniel, that silence meant nothing. But his hands shook as he spoke the words. His heart pounded. He felt as if Daniel was standing behind him, watching him, judging him, saying nothing. He spun around, but the room was empty. His guards rushed in, asking if he was well, and he screamed at them to leave. Alone again, he pressed his head into his hands and whispered to himself that he would not break, he would not break. But even he knew the silence was already breaking him. The galaxy waited for Daniel to finally speak, but he did not. The suspense became unbearable. Every day the question grew louder in their minds. What is the human planning? Why does he say nothing? And when will the silence end? The silence of one human became heavier than the roar of armies. Days had passed since the insult in the great chamber, yet Daniel still had not spoken, and his refusal to break the silence was spreading through the station like a shadow. Every alien race had heard the story, and every corridor whispered about the man who stood against an insult without a word. Some said he was planning revenge, some said humans had strange powers, some believed his silence was already a weapon. No one agreed on what the truth was, but all agreed on one thing. The silence was becoming unbearable. The alien ambassador who spat in Daniel's face felt it the most. Each morning he woke with his throat dry, his chest tight, and his hands trembling. He told himself he was strong. He told himself he was right to insult the human race. But deep down he knew he had made a mistake that could not be undone. The silence was chasing him. It filled his nights with restless dreams. It filled his days with paranoia. He heard whispers in the hall that stopped when he entered. He saw glances that lingered too long. He felt the weight of judgment pressing against his mind. None of this came from Daniel's mouth. Yet it was all connected to him that when he returned to the council chamber, the silence followed him like a shadow. The other delegates no longer laughed at his boldness. Instead, they looked away. They did not want Daniel's eyes on them. They did not want that silence turned in their direction. Even the guards who once stood tall now avoided meeting the human's gaze. The ambassador tried to speak loudly, tried to dominate the debates, but each time his words sounded smaller, weaker, as if swallowed by the silence that clung to Daniel. Daniel sat still in his chair, hands folded, face calm, eyes steady. He listened to everything but gave nothing back. He let the silence grow. He let it spread, and slowly the council began to bend around him. No one admitted it openly, but all of them felt it. The balance of power had shifted without a single human word. Inside the human embassy, Daniel remained as still as stone. His aides grew nervous, wondering if he would ever speak again. Some of them worried the silence might break him too, but others began to understand. They saw the way alien delegates avoided him in the corridors. They saw the way whispers filled the halls. They saw the way fear grew in the eyes of those who once mocked humanity. They realized Daniel was showing the galaxy a lesson. Silence can be sharper than any blade. The ambassador who spat could no longer sleep. He paced his quarters at night, muttering to himself, replaying the moment again and again. He spat in the human's face and expected anger, expected a fight, expected something he could crush. Instead, he received nothing, and that nothing grew larger every day. He started to believe Daniel's silence was alive, that it followed him, that it watched him. He heard footsteps in empty halls. He felt eyes on him when he was alone. He dreamed of silence pressing against his chest until he could not breathe. His guards heard him cry out in the night, but none dared to question him. One evening he stormed into the council chamber long after the meetings had ended. The hall was empty except for the shadows and the faint echo of his own steps. He stood in the center where Daniel once stood and shouted into the silence. He shouted that humans were weak, that silence meant nothing, that he was not afraid. But the walls only returned his words to him, hollow and empty. The more he shouted, the weaker his voice became until finally he dropped to his knees, shaking. Alone in the vast chamber, he realized he was not shouting at Daniel anymore. He was shouting at himself, trying to drown out the silence inside his own mind. The next morning he entered the council chamber with eyes red and shoulders heavy. Delegates noticed the change. He no longer looked strong, no longer looked proud. He looked haunted. Daniel sat across from him, calm as ever, and for a brief moment their eyes met. The ambassador looked away instantly, unable to hold the stare. That single glance was enough to silence him for the rest of the session. Across the station, the silence was turning into something larger than fear. Delegates began to question their own arrogance. They remembered how they had mocked humans as reckless and weak. Yet here was one man shaking the entire council without a weapon, without an army, without even words. Some races who had never respected Earth before began to speak differently. In private, they wondered if this silence was proof that humanity carried something unique in their spirit. Something that could not be measured by ships or numbers. Daniel himself did not smile, did not gloat, did not change. He remained calm, silent, steady, as if nothing around him mattered. But inside his mind he carried the memory of Earth, of battles fought with grit, of survival through pain, of lessons written in blood and sacrifice. He knew silence was not weakness, silence was discipline. It was the weight of history carried in stillness. And he knew the galaxy was beginning to learn it too. The ambassador who spat began to lose control of himself. He shouted at his aides, accused them of betrayal, struck at them in sudden rages. They whispered that he was falling apart, that the human silence was breaking him piece by piece. They feared to stay near him, but feared more to leave him. In the end, he locked himself. Away, speaking only to himself, pacing, muttering, trembling. He told himself again and again that he had won, but the truth was written in his eyes. He was losing. The council began to shift in quiet ways. Delegates who once dismissed human voices now listened more carefully. Leaders who once ignored Earth now considered them more seriously. And all of this happened without Daniel speaking a single word. The silence was winning. The silence was reshaping the galaxy. By the end of the week, the ambassador who spat was no longer the one others feared. Now they feared the human. They feared the silence. They feared what might happen when it finally ended. Because everyone knew it could not last forever. One day Daniel would speak, and whatever he said would change everything. And that was the thought that haunted the galaxy most of all. The alien ambassador who had spat in Daniel's face could no longer control himself. Each day, each hour, each moment spent near the human envoy had broken down a little of his pride, until finally it shattered completely. He had tried everything he knew to restore his confidence. He had shouted, threatened, insulted, and yet nothing worked. Daniel remained still, calm, silent. And in that stillness lay the strength that no words or weapons could match. The ambassador entered the council chamber that day with fire in his eyes and a trembling body. His guards and aides followed, unsure whether to fear him or fear the man he had insulted. Daniel sat across from him, hands folded, eyes fixed, silent as always. The chamber itself seemed to grow smaller, tighter, heavier. The walls pressed. Inward, the air thickened, and even the most powerful alien delegates felt the tension crawl under their skin. This was not the usual power struggle of politics. This was something older, something sharper, something alive. The ambassador roared, shouting that humans were weak, that silence meant nothing, that he would not be controlled by a mere human. His voice echoed off the walls, bounced from the ceiling, yet it sounded hollow, empty, even to him. Daniel did not move. He did not blink. He did not flinch. The silence of one human was louder, stronger, more terrifying than all the shouting in the galaxy. Every word the ambassador spoke seemed to feed the silence rather than destroy it. The chamber grew heavier with each sentence. Delegates stopped taking notes. They stopped whispering. Some even covered their ears, unable to bear the weight of the tension. The ambassador's face twisted in confusion and fear. He had never faced such a thing. No alien, no council, no enemy in history had ever done this to him. He realized now, too late, that his insult had awakened something he could not fight with force or anger. Daniel stood slowly. His movements were measured, calm, deliberate. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture violently. He simply stood, and the room changed. Every alien present felt it, though no one could explain how. The temperature dropped slightly, the shadows shifted, the weight of presence pressed down like gravity. The ambassador staggered back a step as if invisible hands held him in place. His eyes widened, his jaw dropped, and for the first time he felt fear that had nothing to do with weapons or armies. Daniel stepped forward, silent as a shadow. His calmness was a weapon sharper than any blade, more powerful than any cannon. The ambassador's knees shook. He tried to shout, to move, to strike, but his body betrayed him. Every attempt failed because the silence was everywhere, in the walls, in the air, in his chest, in his mind. He had mocked a human for weakness, yet now he was the one trapped, the one under invisible chains, the one losing control without understanding why. Delegates watched in awe and horror. Some whispered that this was impossible, that a human could not hold such power without speaking. Others felt the truth settle cold in their hearts. Humans were not weak. Humans were unpredictable. Humans were something no one could easily measure or defeat. The ambassador who had spat was now a living warning. The galaxy had just witnessed how one human's silence could crush pride. break ego, and dominate without violence. The ambassador fell to the ground. His guards rushed forward, but even they hesitated. Their weapons felt useless. Their training irrelevant, because the human was not using weapons. Daniel had not even touched him. All he had done was stand, calm, unbroken, silent, and it was enough. The ambassador's body shook as if the silence itself had weight, as if it had grown into a physical force pressing him to the floor. He whimpered, tried to crawl backward, but the invisible pressure held him still. Daniel's eyes did not change. They remained steady, full of quiet judgment and unshakable will. His presence alone communicated the truth. Humanity cannot be controlled with insults, cannot be dominated with arrogance, and cannot be broken by fear. The ambassador's mind struggled to understand what had happened. He had thought himself superior, invincible, clever, and strong. One human had shown him the opposite. And the lesson was terrifying. The other delegates no longer whispered to each other. They could not. Every eye was on Daniel. Every thought was heavy with awe and fear. The silence was contagious, a wave that swept across the chamber and left no one untouched. Aliens who had laughed at humanity now lowered their heads. Those who had ignored Earth now reconsidered their judgments. And all of them knew, without a word, that something had shifted forever. The ambassador could barely speak. His pride, his anger, his confidence had all drained away like water from a broken vessel. He realized now that this human could have destroyed him with words, with weapons, with armies, but he had chosen a different power, one older and stronger than anything he had ever faced. The power of stillness, the power of patience, the power of human silence. Daniel finally spoke, but it was not a shout, it was not a command. It was a calm, clear, measured voice that cut through the chamber like sunlight piercing through storm clouds. He said only one sentence: "A human does not need to shout to be heard." The words were simple, but the weight behind them made every alien present shiver. The ambassador who had spat shrank back, defeated, broken, humiliated in a way that no insult could compare. The chamber went silent again, but this silence was different. It was a silence of respect, of fear, of understanding. The lesson was clear to all. Humanity was not weak, humanity was not simple, and humanity's strength did not always come from weapons or armies. Sometimes the greatest power was patience, calm, and the refusal to react to insults. Sometimes the strongest voice was no voice at all. By the end of that day, the ambassador who had spat was never the same. He moved through the halls quietly, avoiding Daniel's gaze, haunted by the memory of his failure. He whispered warnings to others, trying to preserve what little pride remained, but the lesson had spread. Every race on the station now knew the name of the human who had silenced one of the most arrogant aliens without a single blow. Every corner of the station carried the story, and the galaxy began to reconsider what it truly meant to face humanity. Breaking point had come, but the story was not over. The ambassador's failure had shown the power of silence, but it had also shown the galaxy the resolve, courage, and intelligence of a single human. The next step was yet to come, but one thing was certain. The galaxy would never forget the day one human silenced an alien empire without a word, and the lesson would echo far beyond the walls of that chamber. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. News of what happened in the council chamber traveled faster than the fastest ships. One human, standing silently against an insult, had reshaped how aliens thought about Earth and its people. The ambassador who had spat was no longer feared, he was avoided. His pride was shattered, his arrogance burned away by something he could not touch, something he could not fight. Daniel's silence had done what weapons, armies, and threats could not. For Daniel, the moment was quiet. He had stood, he had endured, he had waited. Now the room, once filled with fear and whispers, was full of eyes fixed on him, waiting for what he would do next. Would he speak? Would he attack? Would he finally show that humans were violent like the others believed? Daniel remained calm. He understood the weight of this moment. One word, one gesture, could show the galaxy what humanity truly was. One wrong move and all respect could vanish. The alien council waited. They had expected rage, expected vengeance, expected something loud and forceful. But Daniel did not deliver anger. He did not deliver power in the way they imagined. He delivered understanding, discipline, and truth. He finally spoke, but his voice was quiet, clear, and strong. Humans do not need to shout to be heard. We do not need to fight to prove strength. We endure, we survive, we act when the moment is right. His words were simple, yet every alien in the chamber felt their weight. The silence that had grown for days now became a voice more powerful than any weapon. The ambassador who spat tried to respond, tried to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He realized he had underestimated humanity, not just Daniel, but the entire species. They were clever, patient, and strong in ways he could not measure. His arrogance, his insult, his belief that a human could be broken had led to his own humiliation. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of defeat and acknowledgement, though the shame in his heart ran far deeper than any visible sign. The council members, who had watched with fear and awe, began to whisper. They spoke in hushed tones about the patience of humans, the quiet strength that could change entire halls without raising a weapon. Some admitted privately that Earth's people might be the most dangerous race in the galaxy, not because they were the strongest physically, but because they understood endurance, courage, and timing. The galaxy had learned that brute force was not always the answer, and that wisdom, restraint, and patience could be a far deadlier weapon. Daniel's aides watched him with pride. They had trained with him, fought with him, and now they understood the lesson he had been teaching without words. Humans were not reckless, they were not weak, they were not simple. Humans were disciplined, intelligent, and capable of using silence, patience, and observation as a weapon stronger than fire, steel, or energy beams. Daniel had proven that one human, standing firm, could challenge centuries of arrogance and change the course of perception forever. The ambassador who spat had no words, no pride left to argue, and no allies willing to defend him. He had been broken not by force, not by threat, not by numbers, but by something he could not understand, something he had ignored, the quiet, unwavering strength of one human. And the lesson spread beyond the council chamber, across the station, through the fleets, and to the worlds that had dismissed Earth as primitive. Every delegate, every leader, every soldier, and every scholar began to rethink what humans could do when underestimated. As the days passed, Daniel remained calm, observing, never raising his voice unnecessarily, never acting before the time was right. Yet every action he took, every decision he made, carried weight. Aliens followed his movements in secret, studied his choices, and wondered what other hidden strengths humanity might have. Some tried to provoke, some tried to test, but none succeeded. Silence and patience had become weapons that could not be predicted or countered. The ambassador who spat learned the hardest lesson. Underestimating a human could destroy pride, reputation, and confidence without ever touching a single hair. Finally, Daniel returned to the human embassy. The hallways, once crowded with whispers and rumors, were quiet. His aides walked with him, proud of what they had witnessed, proud to serve with a human who carried the weight of his species with courage, intelligence, and patience. He did not boast. He did not celebrate. He simply walked, steady, calm, a quiet example of the power humans held not in their fists, but in their minds and hearts. Even the ambassador who had insulted him did not follow. He remained behind, haunted by the memory of what had happened, unable to look Daniel in the eye again. And yet, the ambassador would carry that lesson forever. The galaxy would carry that lesson forever. One human had changed everything, and it would never be forgotten. In the quiet that followed, the council began to respect humanity in ways they had never imagined. Humans were no longer the reckless newcomers. They were a force to be reckoned with, not because of fleets or weapons, but because of their discipline, patience, and intelligence. They had the ability to endure insult, survive humiliation, and act at the perfect moment with power far greater than any alien imagined. Daniel had proven this beyond doubt, and every corner of the galaxy took notice. The final lesson was simple, yet eternal. A human could silence an empire without a word. Without anger, without violence. The galaxy learned to respect the calm, the patience, the quiet strength that humans carried in their hearts. Daniel had done what no army could, what no weapon could, and what no threat could achieve. He had shown that true power was not always loud or violent. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and unyielding. And as Daniel looked out at the stars, calm and still, he knew humanity's journey in the galaxy had only just begun. The lesson had been learned. The galaxy would never underestimate humans again. And one day, when the time was right, they would see what else humans could do, silently, patiently, and with a strength no one could measure or defeat. The silence had ended, but its power had only begun.